I've always been the kind of person who enjoys solitude. Growing up in a big city with constant noise and chaos, I developed a love for quiet, out-of-the-way places. In the fall of 2016, I finally decided to rent a cabin for a week in the northern woods of Minnesota. It wasn't completely off the grid, but it was remote enough to feel like an escape. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just trees and the occasional sound of wildlife. The cabin was small and old, tucked into a clearing about a mile off a dirt road. It had a wood-burning stove, a rickety porch, and a single bedroom. There was no Wi-Fi or television, but I didn't mind. I had brought books, my journal, and enough food to last the week. I wanted a break from everything. No work emails, no news, no distractions. I arrived on a crisp October afternoon. The leaves were fiery shades of orange and red, and the air was cool but not too cold. The drive up had been uneventful, though the last stretch of dirt road was rough, with deep ruts and overgrown bushes scratching at the sides of my car. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for, peaceful and isolated. The first few days were perfect. I spent my mornings hiking the trails nearby, my afternoons reading on the porch, and my evenings by the fire. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first, but I quickly grew to love it. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the distant howl of coyotes at night. On the fourth day, I decided to explore a trail I hadn't taken yet. It was marked on the map provided by the cabin owner, winding several miles deeper into the woods before looping back toward the cabin. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, locked up the cabin, and set off around mid-morning. The trail was beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The sunlight filtered through the trees in dappled patches, and the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I walked for about an hour before I noticed something odd. There was a faint, acrid smell in the air, like burning plastic. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to make me pause. I looked around, wondering if there was a wildfire nearby, but I didn't see any smoke. The smell lingered for a few minutes before fading, and I brushed it off as some nearby campers burning trash. About 20 minutes later, I stumbled across something strange. Just off the trail, partially hidden by bushes, was an old campsite. There were two small tents, both collapsed and covered in dirt and leaves, and a rusted-out fire pit surrounded by beer cans and trash. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to investigate further. Curiosity won out, and I stepped off the trail to take a closer look. The tents were empty, their fabric torn and faded from exposure. The fire pit was cold, filled with charred logs and unburned trash. There were no signs of recent activity, but the whole scene felt off. I decided to head back to the trail and continue my hike. As I turned to leave, I noticed something sticking out of the dirt near one of the tents. It was a small plastic bag, partially buried, with what looked like white powder inside. My stomach tightened. I'd seen enough crime shows to know what it probably was, and I didn't want anything to do with it. I quickly made my way back to the trail, feeling uneasy. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods seemed quieter than before, the shadows darker. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to set. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows, something I hadn't done the previous nights. I couldn't explain why I felt so nervous. Nothing had happened, really, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises outside, like branches snapping or leaves crunching. At first, I told myself it was just animals, but the sounds were too deliberate, too human. Around midnight, I finally fell into a restless sleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of a car engine. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest house was miles away. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept to the window. Through the curtains, I could see the faint glow of headlights through the trees. The car was parked on the dirt road, just out of sight of the cabin. I couldn't see who was inside, but the engine was still running. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the headlights turned off and the engine went silent. The night seemed unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Should I call for help? There was no cell service out here, and the landline in the cabin had been disconnected years ago. I felt completely isolated, trapped. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, clutching the flashlight. Minutes turned into hours, and I didn't hear anything else. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I summoned the courage to look outside. The car was gone. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little sound. I thought about leaving early, but I'd paid for the week, and I didn't want to let my imagination ruin the trip. I convinced myself that the car had been a coincidence. Maybe someone had gotten lost or stopped to sleep. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for extra security. I didn't sleep much, but nothing happened. The following morning, I decided to check out the campsite again. I don't know why. It felt like a stupid idea even as I was doing it, but I wanted to make sure I hadn't imagined the whole thing. When I reached the spot, I froze. The plastic bag was gone. My heart started racing, and I turned around, scanning the woods. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I quickly made my way back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, listening as the footsteps stopped and started again. When they finally stopped for good, I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed my things and left. As I drove away, I noticed tire tracks on the dirt road. They hadn't been there before. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I haven't been back to the woods since. It was a Friday night in late October, and the rain poured down harder than I'd seen in years. The windshield wipers on my old sedan barely kept up, smearing water across the glass as I navigated the winding mountain road. I had driven up here for a mandatory weekend retreat with my bank senior staff. The meeting was arranged by our general manager, Mr. Walker, who insisted that this isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere would help us reconnect with our goals. Frankly, I would have rather been home with a book or asleep, but there was no saying no to Mr. Walker. He was the kind of man who demanded results and tolerated no excuses. When he sent the email inviting, more like commanding, us to the retreat, everyone knew they had to be there, no matter how inconvenient. The rain didn't let up as I finally spotted the turnoff for the cabin. The sign was almost invisible in the dark and rain, but my GPS insisted it was the right place. Gravel crunched under my tires as I followed the narrow driveway through dense trees, their branches sagging under the weight of water. The headlights barely lit the way, and I felt a small pang of anxiety. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and I still hadn't spotted the cabin. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trees opened up into a clearing, and the cabin stood there, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. It was bigger than I expected, with 2 stories and wide, wooden beams. A few faint lights glowed in the windows, indicating that I wasn't the first to arrive. I parked beside a couple of other cars and grabbed my bag from the trunk, the rain soaking me instantly. The air was cold, and the storm showed no signs of easing. My shoes squelched as I climbed the wooden steps to the front porch. The door was unlocked, and I stepped inside, shaking off the rain like a wet dog. The cabin's interior was rustic but comfortable. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and mismatched furniture that looked like it came from a yard sale. A few of my colleagues were already there, gathered near the fireplace with steaming mugs. They nodded at me but didn't say much. I found a corner to settle into, pulling off my wet jacket and shoes. The atmosphere was heavy, not just from the storm outside but from the tension that seemed to hang over the room. Everyone knew Mr. Walker wasn't one for casual gatherings. There was always an agenda, always some point he was trying to drive home. The first meeting was scheduled for that night. It was held in a large room upstairs that had been set up with a long wooden table and several chairs. Mr. Walker was already there, standing at the head of the table with his ever-present stern expression. He was a tall man in his 50s, with gray hair neatly combed back and a suit that seemed out of place in the cabin's rustic setting. We all took our seats and the meeting began. Mr. Walker talked about quarterly goals, operational efficiency, and performance benchmarks. His voice was steady and commanding, but the storm outside grew louder, the wind howling like it wanted to rip the cabin apart. Occasionally, the lights flickered, and I found myself glancing at the windows, half expecting something to appear out there in the dark. The meeting dragged on, and by the time we wrapped up, it was past midnight. Mr. Walker dismissed us, but not before reminding us that we'd be starting early the next morning. I headed back downstairs, exhausted and irritable. Most of the others had already claimed the better rooms, so I ended up in a small one at the far end of the hallway. It had a single bed, a tiny window, and an old wardrobe that creaked ominously when I opened it to hang up my jacket. The storm raged on as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The rain hammered against the window, and the wind seemed to whisper through the cracks in the walls. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been building all night. Something about this place felt wrong. I told myself it was just my imagination, a combination of the storm and my dislike for these kinds of retreats. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to a loud banging noise. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, straining to hear over the storm. The sound came again, 3 sharp, deliberate bangs. It wasn't the kind of noise the wind or rain could make. It sounded like it was coming from downstairs. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 2:47 a.m. For a moment, I debated whether I should go investigate or just stay in my room and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But the thought of something or someone being in the cabin made my skin crawl. I slipped on my shoes and quietly opened the door. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the emergency lanterns we'd set up earlier in case the power went out. I crept down the stairs, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The banging noise had stopped, but the uneasy feeling in my gut had only grown stronger. Downstairs, the main room was empty. The fireplace had gone out, and the only sound was the rain pounding against the windows. I checked the front door, it was locked. The banging couldn't have come from there. I moved through the room, checking the windows and other doors. Everything seemed secure, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. As I stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, I noticed something strange. One of the chairs near the table was out of place, tilted back as if someone had been sitting in it and left in a hurry. I was sure it hadn't been like that when I went to bed. I decided to check on the others. I went back upstairs and knocked on a few doors, but no one answered. The rooms were empty, the beds untouched. Panic started to set in. Where had everyone gone? I was certain they hadn't left the cabin. No one would drive in this storm. I went back downstairs, my mind racing. That's when I noticed something else. A faint trail of wet footprints leading from the back door toward the stairs. The door was still locked, but the footprints were fresh, like someone had walked in from the rain. I followed the footprints upstairs, my hands trembling. They led to the room next to mine. The door was slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered like a dying bulb. I pushed the door open, and my stomach dropped. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, rain pouring in and soaking the floor. On the bed was a piece of paper, weighted down with a small rock. Picked it up, my heart pounding. The note was written in shaky handwriting. At that moment, I heard the banging noise again, this time coming from the attic. It was louder now, more insistent. I wanted to run, to get out of that cabin and never look back, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was going on. I found the attic door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly open, and cold air seeped through the gap. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. When I reached the top, I found the attic empty except for a single chair in the center of the room. On the chair was another note, this one reading. I didn't wait to find out what too late meant. I ran back to my room, grabbed my bag, and bolted for the front door. The storm was still raging, but I didn't care. I got into my car and drove away, my tires skidding on the wet gravel. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow on the road, every flicker of movement in the trees made my heart race. When I finally reached the main road, the rain started to ease, but the unease didn't. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out what happened to the others. The bank closed a few months later, and Mr. Walker disappeared without a trace. To this day, I don't know if it was all some elaborate prank or something far more sinister. All I know is that I've never felt safe alone at night since. It was late October when my sister Emily, her husband Jake, my boss Carl, and I decided to spend a weekend at a secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. It was Emily's idea, a chance to disconnect from our busy lives and reconnect with each other. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of sharing a cabin with my boss, but Carl had been a family friend for years, and Emily thought it would be good for all of us to bond outside of work. The cabin belonged to one of Jake's old college friends, and it was as remote as it could get. It sat at the end of a narrow, unpaved road surrounded by dense forest, with no cell service and the nearest town almost an hour's drive away. Jake assured us it was the perfect spot for a quiet getaway, far from the noise and stress of everyday life. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, the trees a mix of orange and red, and the sun was dipping low on the horizon. The cabin itself was modest, 2 stories with a weathered wooden exterior, a stone chimney, and a small porch overlooking a lake. The view was stunning, but the isolation was palpable. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine. The main floor had a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. Upstairs, there were 2 more bedrooms and a tiny bathroom. The furniture was old but sturdy, and a few deer antlers adorned the walls. There was no electricity, only a generator Jake warned us to use sparingly. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before nightfall. By the time we finished, the sun had set, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. Jake started a fire in the fireplace while Emily prepared a simple dinner. Carl and I sat at the table, nursing beers and making small talk. The quiet was unnerving. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I dismissed it as paranoia. The woods always made me uneasy. That first night was uneventful. We ate, played cards by lantern light, and turned in early. I slept fitfully, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest keeping me awake. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the trees outside made my heart race. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. Jake wanted to hike a nearby trail he'd read about, and the rest of us reluctantly agreed. The trail was overgrown, more of a deer path than anything else, and it wound deeper into the forest than I was comfortable with. The trees were tall and close together, their branches blocking out much of the daylight. The air was cold and damp, and every step seemed to echo in the silence. After an hour of walking, we came across an old, abandoned cabin. It was smaller than the one we were staying in, with a sagging roof and broken windows. Jake, always the adventurous type, wanted to investigate. Emily and Carl stayed back while I followed him inside. The place was empty, just a single room with a collapsed bed and a rusty stove. Felt wrong, though, like we were intruding. I was relieved when Jake finally decided to leave. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the abandoned cabin had given me. When we returned to our cabin, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. We spent the afternoon relaxing by the lake, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, things took a turn. We were sitting by the fire, talking and laughing, when we heard it. A distant, high-pitched scream. It was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the stillness of the night. We froze, listening. A second scream followed, closer this time. It sounded human, but distorted, like someone in agony. Jake grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The others stayed behind, their faces pale with fear. Outside, the forest was pitch black, the only light coming from Jake's flashlight. The screams had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. We circled the cabin, finding nothing. Jake wanted to check the edge of the lake, but I convinced him to go back inside. Something about the screams felt wrong, too deliberate, almost like a lure. Back in the cabin, we locked the doors and windows and agreed to stay inside for the rest of the night. None of us slept well. Every sound outside, the wind in the trees, the crack of a branch, set us on edge. By morning, we were all exhausted. Jake suggested we pack up and leave, but Carl insisted we stay. He thought it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a bobcat. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We spent most of the day inside, too afraid to venture out. Jake tried to keep things light, but the tension was palpable. As the day wore on, the feeling of being watched returned. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shadow or a flicker of light, but when I looked closer, there was nothing. That evening, as the sun set, we heard it again. The same scream, this time much closer. It sent chills down my spine. Jake wanted to investigate, but Emily and I begged him to stay inside. Reluctantly, he agreed. We huddled in the living room, the fire crackling in the fireplace, and waited. The hours dragged on. The screams stopped, but the sense of dread only grew. Around midnight, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the dying fire. Jake tried to restart the generator but couldn't get it working. We were on our own. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Jake grabbed a knife from the kitchen while Carl armed himself with a heavy flashlight. Emily and I sat on the couch, too terrified to move. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud bang on the front door. It sounded like someone throwing their full weight against it. Jake and Carl stood frozen, weapons in hand, as the banging continued. Suddenly, it stopped. The silence was deafening. We waited, hearts pounding, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Jake peeked out the window. There was nothing there, no sign of anyone or anything. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. By morning, we decided to leave. We packed our things quickly, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and the cabin. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, watching us. When I looked again, it was gone. We never found out who or what was out there. Jake later joked that it was probably just a prankster or a hunter, but none of us really believed that. The screams, the footsteps, the banging on the door, it was too deliberate, too calculated. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened that weekend. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places are better left untouched. It was the winter of 2019, and I decided to spend a few weeks in a remote cabin I'd rented deep in the forests of northern Montana. I was 31 at the time, and my life in the city had become suffocating. The noise, the people, the endless grind. I just needed some time to myself. The cabin seemed perfect. It was miles from the nearest town, completely surrounded by snow-covered pines, with no cell service or internet. The realtor assured me the place had everything I'd need: a wood stove, plenty of firewood, and a small generator for basic electricity. When I arrived, the cabin was even more isolated than I had imagined. The dirt road leading to it was barely passable due to the snow, and by the time I parked my SUV near the front porch, my tires were half buried. The cabin itself was small and rustic, just a single-story structure with a steep roof to shed the snow. Inside, it smelled of pine and old wood, and the walls were lined with shelves of books and jars filled with preserved goods. There was no TV, just a radio, and the only source of heat was the wood stove in the corner. I liked it. Felt like a step back in time. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings reading by the fire and my afternoons hiking through the forest, the snow crunching beneath my boots. At night, I'd cook simple meals on the propane stove and watch the flames dance in the wood stove until I grew too tired to keep my eyes open. The silence was incredible. No cars, no voices, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the howl of the wind outside. But on the fifth night, I noticed something strange. I was sitting by the fire, reading, when I heard a faint noise outside. It wasn't the wind. It was more rhythmic, like the crunch of footsteps in the snow. I froze, listening carefully, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal passing by. This was the wilderness, after all. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin just to ease my mind. The snow was deep, but I could clearly see tracks leading from the tree line to the back of the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. My stomach dropped. The prints circled the cabin and then disappeared back into the woods. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived, and the nearest neighbor was supposed to be miles away. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little sound. I told myself it could have been an old set of tracks I hadn't noticed before, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. They were fresh, and they hadn't been there the day before. That night, I locked the cabin door and propped a chair under the handle for good measure. I kept the fire going, hoping the light would deter anyone or anything from coming near. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was fitful. I woke up several times, thinking I'd heard something outside, but each time, the cabin was silent. On the seventh day, I decided to hike out to the main road to see if I could spot any signs of other people. The snow had stopped, and the sun was out, making the trek a little easier. It was about 2 miles to the road, and when I reached it, I saw nothing, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. I stood there for a while, scanning the trees, but everything was still. Eventually, I turned back, feeling more uneasy than ever. When I returned to the cabin, I found something that made my blood run cold. The chair I'd left propped against the door was on the floor, and the door was slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it before I left. My first instinct was to grab the hatchet I kept by the woodpile outside, but as I stepped inside, I saw no signs of anyone. Nothing was missing or out of place, but the fact that someone had been inside while I was gone was enough to make me feel sick. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe I hadn't latched the door properly. Maybe the wind had knocked it open. But that didn't explain the footprints or the feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire with the hatchet in my lap, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the logs. Around midnight, I thought I heard faint footsteps outside again, but they stopped as soon as they started. I didn't dare go out to check. The next morning, I decided it was time to leave. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the SUV. The snow was deep, but I was confident I could make it back to town. As I started the engine, I glanced at the cabin one last time, and that's when I saw it. In the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing was a figure. They were partially hidden by the branches, but I could see enough to know they were watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but they were wearing dark clothes, and their posture was unnervingly still. My heart was pounding as I threw the SUV into reverse and backed out onto the narrow road. I didn't take my eyes off the figure until the cabin disappeared from view. The drive back to town was nerve-wracking. The narrow, snow-covered road twisted through the forest, and every shadow felt like it was hiding someone or something. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station on the edge of town. There, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I reported what happened to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. They chalked it up to a trespasser or a drifter passing through, but their lack of urgency didn't sit well with me. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I was scrolling through local news out of curiosity when I came across a story about a missing person. A hiker had vanished in the same area where the cabin was located. The article mentioned that their campsite had been found abandoned, with strange tracks leading away from it, boot prints circling the site before disappearing into the woods. I was 19 the summer I agreed to help my friend Jake clean out his grandmother's old farm cabin. She had passed away the year before, and the property had been sitting empty ever since. Jake's family had decided to sell it, but they needed to clear out decades of accumulated belongings first. He asked me to come along for a few days to help, promising it'd be easy work and that we'd have the place to ourselves. The cabin was deep in rural Minnesota, surrounded by miles of woods and farmland. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and the town was a good 20-minute drive. It was the kind of place where cell service was spotty at best, and the nights were pitch black without city lights. We drove out there on a warm Friday afternoon in Jake's rusty old pickup, loaded with supplies and a few tools. The road turned from asphalt to gravel and finally to a narrow dirt path that led through dense trees. The cabin appeared as we rounded a bend, an old, weathered structure with peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a porch that looked ready to collapse. Jake parked the truck, and we hauled our gear inside. The cabin smelled musty, like old wood and mildew. The floors creaked underfoot, and dust coated every surface. The furniture was outdated, and the walls were lined with shelves crammed full of knickknacks, books, and other odds and ends. We spent the first evening sorting through the smaller rooms, tossing junk into garbage bags and setting aside anything that looked valuable. By the time the sun set, we were sweaty and covered in dust. Jake started a small fire in the old stone fireplace, and we ate sandwiches while sitting on the worn-out couch. The first night passed uneventfully. The cabin was eerily quiet, with only the occasional sound of crickets or the distant hoot of an owl. I slept on a creaky cot in one of the spare rooms while Jake took the main bedroom. The next morning, we tackled the kitchen and living room. It was slow going. The kitchen cabinets were stuffed with expired canned goods and ancient appliances. The living room had piles of old newspapers, photo albums, and boxes full of who knows what. By mid-afternoon, we decided to take a break. Jake mentioned there was a small barn out back that he wanted to check out. We grabbed some water bottles and headed outside. The barn was in worse shape than the cabin. The roof was partially caved in, and the wooden doors hung crookedly on their hinges. Inside, it was mostly empty except for a few rusted tools, some rotting hay, and an old workbench. As we poked around, I noticed something odd near the back wall. The floorboards looked newer than the rest, and they were nailed down in a neat square. I pointed it out to Jake, and we decided to pry them up. Underneath was a small, dark hole about 3 feet deep. Inside, we found a rusted metal box. It was locked, but the hinges were so corroded that we were able to force it open with a crowbar. The box contained a few crumpled bills, some old photographs, and a bundle of letters tied with string. The photos were black and white, showing what I assumed were Jake's grandparents and some unidentified people. The letters were faded and hard to read, but they seemed to be written by Jake's grandfather to someone named Earl. Jake didn't seem too interested, so we left the box in the barn and headed back to the cabin. That evening, as we were sorting through more of the living room, I noticed something strange. A chair that had been against the wall earlier was now in the middle of the room. I assumed Jake had moved it, but when I asked, he shrugged and said he hadn't touched it. It wasn't a big deal, but it made me uneasy. I brushed it off and kept working. Later that night, as we were sitting by the fire, I thought I heard a faint thud coming from somewhere outside. I paused, listening, but it didn't happen again. Jake didn't seem to notice, so I didn't mention it. I had trouble sleeping that night. The cabin felt different, like the air was heavier or the shadows were darker. Every creak and groan of the old would put me on edge. The next day, we decided to tackle the attic. The narrow staircase was steep and creaky, and the attic itself was dimly lit by a single bare bulb. The space was cramped, with low ceilings and cobwebs in every corner. As we dug through boxes of old clothes and holiday decorations, I found a wooden chest shoved against the far wall. It was locked, but the lock was so old it practically fell apart in my hands. Inside were more photographs and a few personal items, including a hunting knife and a worn leather journal. The journal was written by Jake's grandfather, detailing life on the farm. Most of it was mundane, notes about crops, weather, and daily chores. But toward the back, the entries became strange. One entry mentioned hearing strange noises at night, like footsteps outside the cabin or tapping on the windows. Another described finding dead animals near the barn, their bodies mutilated in ways he couldn't explain. Jake read over my shoulder and laughed it off, saying his grandfather was probably just superstitious. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night fell, we were exhausted. We sat by the fire again, trying to relax, but the uneasy feeling from the night before had only grown stronger. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint thud I'd heard the previous night. This time, Jake heard it too. We grabbed flashlights and went outside to investigate. The night was cold and silent, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the gravel. We circled the cabin, but there was nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Back inside, we locked the doors and windows, double-checking everything. Jake shrugged it off, but I was too uneasy to sleep. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the cabin. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I grabbed my phone, bolted out of the room, and ran for the truck. Jake was already outside, looking pale and shaken. He said he'd heard the same footsteps and had seen a shadow pass by his window. We didn't stay to find out what was happening. We jumped in the truck and drove off, leaving the cabin and everything inside behind. Jake's family ended up selling the property a few months later. I never went back, and I don't think Jake did either. To this day, I don't know what we experienced in that cabin. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on our minds, or maybe there was something more to it, something that didn't want us there. All I know is that I still have nightmares about that last night, and I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps in the dark. I had been planning a solo trip for months. Life in the city had grown suffocating, with the endless noise, crowded streets, and constant deadlines. I needed a break, somewhere quiet, away from everything and everyone. After hours of browsing online, I came across a secluded cabin for rent in the Appalachian Mountains. The listing promised solitude, surrounded by miles of forest, with no neighbors for miles. Sounded perfect. It was late November when I finally made the trip. The cold had settled in, and the trees were bare, their branches clawing at the sky. I packed everything I thought I'd need: canned food, bottled water, a heavy sleeping bag, a portable heater, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I even brought a small first aid kit just in case. The cabin was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and the dirt road leading to it was barely wide enough for my car. The thought of being so far from civilization excited me. I wanted the isolation. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly as it had in the photos. A small, one-story structure made of dark wood, with a steep roof and a stone chimney. There was a single front door and 2 windows on either side. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly, a dense tangle of trees and underbrush. The air was crisp and silent, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. It felt like I had stepped into another world. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was simple but cozy. There was a single room with a bed, a small table, and a wood-burning stove. A narrow door led to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a basin. A few shelves lined the walls, holding mismatched plates, cups, and utensils. I set down my bags, lit the small propane lantern I'd brought, and started unpacking. That first night, I fell asleep easily, lulled by the stillness. The darkness outside was absolute, a kind of blackness I'd never experienced in the city. It was unsettling at first, but I reminded myself that I was completely alone out here. There was no one to disturb me. The next day, I spent hours exploring the woods around the cabin. I followed a faint trail that wound through the trees, occasionally stopping to take photos or simply enjoy the quiet. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. That evening, as I sat by the stove, eating a can of chili I'd heated up, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the leaves. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. I locked the door before climbing into bed. The next morning, I found fresh tracks in the dirt just outside the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were human footprints. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin, circling around it before disappearing back into the woods. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived, and I hadn't heard a car or any other signs of human activity. Whoever it was, they had been here during the night. I spent the day trying to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal. Maybe a hiker had wandered too far off the trail and stumbled across the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing just out of sight. I cut my walk short and returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creak of the wood, the whistle of the wind, the rustle of leaves outside. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunching footsteps. This time, they were louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from the table and shone it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the time morning came, I had decided to leave. The isolation I had craved now felt oppressive, suffocating. I packed my things quickly, glancing out the window every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing there. As I loaded my bags into the car, I noticed something new. There were more footprints in the dirt, and this time they were fresh. Whoever had been out here had been watching the cabin again. I drove away as fast as the narrow road would allow, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. But even as I left the cabin behind, the unease lingered. The thought that someone had been out there watching me, refusing to reveal themselves, it stayed with me. A few weeks later, I came across an article about a series of missing persons cases in the area. Hikers and campers had vanished without a trace, their belongings often found abandoned in the woods. My blood ran cold as I read about the footprints, the eerie silence, the feeling of being watched. I wasn't the only one who had experienced it. I realized how lucky I had been to leave when I did. Whoever or whatever was out there in those woods, they weren't just passing through. They were waiting. When my grandfather passed away, I wasn't prepared for the responsibility of taking care of his old cabin. I was 29 and living in the city, far removed from the quiet mountain life my grandfather cherished. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. My parents suggested selling it, but something about letting go of his legacy didn't sit right with me. He had always spoken of that place as his sanctuary, a piece of land untouched by time. So, on a cold October morning in 2022, I packed my truck with supplies and set off to visit the cabin. It had been years since I last saw it, and I knew it would need some maintenance. My grandfather had been stubborn about refusing help, even in his final years, so I expected the place to be in rough shape. The drive up was uneventful. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, and finally a narrow, overgrown trail leading to the property. The air felt different out there, crisp and quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. When I arrived, I parked the truck and stepped out, taking in the cabin. It looked just as I remembered it, though the wood was weathered, and the roof sagged in a few places. The small clearing around it was choked with weeds, and the forest beyond felt denser than I recalled. I grabbed my backpack, a toolbox, and a cooler with enough food to last me a few days. My plan was to assess the place, make a list of repairs, and decide if keeping it was even feasible. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood and mildew. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like lace. The furniture was just as he'd left it: an old rocking chair by the fireplace, a threadbare couch, and a small dining table. His collection of books and maps still lined the shelves, and a few of his personal items, like his boots and hat, remained by the door. I spent the first couple of hours airing the place out and sweeping. The fireplace was clogged with ash and debris, and the woodpile outside was nearly gone. I made a mental note to chop some firewood later. For now, I focused on clearing the paths around the cabin. The woods were alive with sounds: birds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. But there was an undercurrent of stillness that made me uneasy, as if the forest were holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Being in the city for so long had probably dulled my senses. By late afternoon, I had a decent pile of firewood and had cleared most of the weeds. I took a break on the porch, drinking water and watching the sun sink lower. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the trees towering like sentinels. As evening approached, I set up a small fire inside the cabin and cooked a simple meal. The warmth and light eased some of my unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That night, I lay on the old couch, wrapped in a sleeping bag. The cabin creaked and groaned as the temperature dropped, and I heard the occasional rustle outside. I reminded myself that it was probably just animals, raccoons or deer, but around midnight, I heard something heavier, something deliberate. It was faint but distinct, a crunch of gravel near the porch. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept to the window. I scanned the clearing but saw nothing. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the wind or my imagination, but I couldn't relax. I sat up for hours listening, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt near the porch were footprints, barefoot human footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the clearing to the porch and then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here barefoot in the middle of nowhere? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the forest was dense and unforgiving. I decided to spend the day repairing the cabin, hoping to keep my mind busy. I fixed a few loose boards on the porch, patched a hole in the roof, and reinforced the door. But the unease never left me. I found myself glancing toward the woods constantly, half expecting to see someone watching. That night, I kept the fire burning and stayed awake as long as I could. The forest was eerily quiet, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the crunch of gravel, this time circling the cabin. I froze, gripping the flashlight and a small hatchet I'd brought inside. The sound stopped near the back of the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek out the back window. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, but there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I barely slept that night, my ears straining for any sound. By morning, I was on edge. I decided to check the perimeter and look for any signs of someone being there. Near the back of the cabin, I found something chilling. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked. It hadn't been there the day before. My stomach churned as I stared at it. This wasn't random. Someone had been here, and they wanted me to know it. I considered leaving, but something in me refused to back down. This was my grandfather's land, and I wouldn't let some stranger scare me off. I spent the day reinforcing the windows and setting up makeshift barricades around the cabin. I even rigged a few tripwires with cans to make noise if someone approached. By the time night fell, I felt slightly more secure, but the tension in my chest hadn't eased. That night, the noises started earlier. Footsteps, the faint sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. The tripwires didn't go off, but I could feel the presence outside. I sat in the dark, gripping the hatchet, every nerve in my body on edge. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the front door, followed by silence. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door, but I didn't open it. Instead, I shouted through the wood, hoping to scare them off. There was no response, only the sound of retreating footsteps. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were trying to intimidate me. I packed my things quickly, but before leaving, I walked to the edge of the clearing where the footprints had started. There, in the dirt, was another stack of rocks, this one larger than the first. Beside it was a single, muddy handprint on a tree. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I haven't returned to the cabin since. Sometimes I think about selling it, but something stops me. It was my grandfather's sanctuary, and I can't bring myself to let it go. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whoever was out there is still watching, waiting for me to return.